I am Nia, 32 years old. My husband shoved me out into a freezing Atlanta storm and locked the heavy oak door behind me. He laughed as my cheap suitcase sank into the mud, absolutely convinced I had nowhere else to go. Soaked, humiliated, and shaking, I stood in the driveway and prepared to make a single phone call. The next morning, everything he valued began to slip away, and he still had no idea who was holding the leash. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever endured betrayal from the people who were supposed to protect you. The storm over Atlanta that night was absolutely ferocious. Thunder rattled the tall custom windows of our massive brick estate in the exclusive Buckhead neighborhood. The rain was not just falling, it was attacking. It came down in heavy, blinding sheets that turned the expansive manicured front lawn into a flooded swamp. Inside the grand foyer, the air was perfectly climate-controlled. The crystal chandelier cast a warm and golden glow over the imported marble floors. I stood near the entryway, shivering despite the indoor heat. My heart pounded wildly against my ribs. Marcus, my husband of 5 years, stood blocking the hallway. He wore a meticulously tailored navy suit that cost more than most people earned in a month. His posture was rigid and dominant. His face was twisted into a mask of pure disgust. There was no warmth left in his dark eyes. There was only contempt. We had been arguing for less than 10 minutes, but the hostility had been brewing for years. He stepped toward me. He did not speak at first. He simply reached out and grabbed my shoulders. His grip was tight and bruising. He shoved me backward with a sudden and shocking burst of violence. My bare feet slid across the polished marble. I stumbled wildly, struggling to keep my balance. "Get out!" he shouted. His voice echoed off the high ceilings and bounced down the long, elegant corridors of the mansion. He pushed me again, much harder this time. I fell backward through the open doorway. The freezing storm hit me instantly. I landed hard on the wet concrete of the front porch. The icy water immediately soaked through my thin cotton sweater. The brutal wind stole the breath right out of my lungs. I gasped, looking up at the man I had promised to spend my life with. Marcus stepped out onto the covered portion of the porch. The storm raged all around us, but he stood completely protected by the massive stone columns of the entryway. A bright flash of lightning illuminated his face. He was actually smiling. It was a cold and mocking sneer that twisted his handsome features into something truly ugly. "You bring absolutely nothing to this marriage, Nia," he spat. The cruelty in his voice cut much deeper than the freezing rain. "You do not generate revenue. You do not elevate my brand in this city. You are a dead weight, and I am sick and tired of dragging you behind me." I pushed myself up from the hard concrete. My knees were scraped and aching from the fall. I wrapped my arms around my torso, trying to preserve any remaining body heat. Marcus crossed his arms over his chest. He looked down at me like I was a pest infesting his pristine property. "I am a managing director at a top investment bank," he declared. His ego was massive and suffocating. "My hard work pays for this extreme luxury. My name is on the mortgage of this house. My money buys the expensive food you eat and the clothes you wear. You bring zero economic benefit to my life. You are a glorified maid, and I am officially done carrying you." He turned around and marched back into the warm foyer. For a split second, I thought he was going to walk away and leave the door open. I thought he was just trying to scare me into submission. But he reached into the hallway closet and dragged out my suitcase. It was a cheap canvas bag. It was old and frayed at the edges. I had owned it since my college days, long before Marcus started making a six-figure salary and elevating his social status. He held it by the top handle, dangling it like a piece of trash. He walked back to the threshold. He swung his arm back and hurled the bag violently into the darkness. I watched it fly through the heavy rain. It landed with a sickening splash in a deep puddle of red Georgia clay at the very edge of the driveway. The impact was loud and destructive. The cheap zipper burst completely open. My meager belongings spilled out into the thick brown sludge. My simple dresses, my comfortable sweaters, and my worn-out shoes sank directly into the freezing mud. "Look at that garbage," he laughed. It was a cruel and sharp sound that pierced right through the continuous roar of the thunder. "That is exactly what you are worth, Nia." Absolutely nothing. You came into this marriage with nothing, and you are leaving with nothing. Go find a shelter. Go crawl back to whatever miserable hole you came from. Do not bother begging to come back when you realize you cannot survive without my money. I stood there in the pouring rain. The freezing water plastered my hair to my face. The brutal cold seeped directly into my bones, making my teeth chatter. My body shook violently from the drop in temperature, but I absolutely refused to cry. I looked at the ruined suitcase slowly drowning in the mud. I looked back at Marcus. He was completely dry. He was entirely smug. He truly believed he had all the power. He truly believed he had broken my spirit forever. "This house is mine," he said one final time. His voice was laced with ultimate satisfaction and absolute arrogance. He stepped backward into the warm and brightly lit foyer. He gripped the heavy brass handle of the solid oak door. He flashed me one last mocking smile, looking at me as if I was a pathetic joke. The massive door slammed shut with a deafening thud. The sound reverberated heavily through the storm. I heard the sharp and final click of the heavy deadbolt locking into place. I was locked out in the freezing cold. I was completely alone in the dark. The rain continued to attack the pavement around me. The thunder rolled overhead like a dark warning. Marcus thought he had pushed a helpless and dependent woman out into the terrible storm. He thought he had discarded a useless burden with no consequences. He had absolutely no idea what he had just done. I wiped the freezing rain from my eyes and dragged my aching feet across the wet concrete. I did not walk toward the street. I walked straight toward the massive bay windows of the living room. The sheer silk curtains were drawn back, allowing the warm, golden light from the crystal chandelier to spill out onto the flooded lawn. I could see absolutely everything happening inside. The rain beat down on my shoulders, and the cold seeped deeply into my organs, but the freezing storm outside was nothing compared to the absolute chilling reality playing out inside my own home. Marcus was not alone. My mother Valerie sat comfortably on the expensive velvet sofa like a queen holding court. She held a crystal glass filled with expensive red wine. She was smiling brightly, her teeth perfectly white against her dark skin. My younger sister Chloe stood right next to her, holding the hand of her husband Julian. Julian was a white man who spoke loudly and constantly, promised the world to anyone who would listen. He claimed to be a groundbreaking tech genius. He claimed his new software startup was a billion-dollar project destined to change the entire financial industry. Marcus absolutely adored Julian. My mother Valerie worshipped the ground Julian walked upon. Chloe flaunted Julian around elite Atlanta circles like a prized, exotic trophy. And me, I was just the dirt beneath all of their feet. I cooked, I washed, I endured the contempt. I cooked their elaborate holiday meals while they sat around drinking expensive imported champagne and complaining that the meat was slightly overdone. I cooked the extravagant engagement dinner for Chloe and Julian, making sure every single detail was absolutely perfect for my younger sister. I washed the designer clothes my mother constantly bought for Chloe while ignoring my basic needs. I washed the crystal glasses they left scattered across my home after their lavish networking parties. I endured the contempt from my own blood when they repeatedly called me the plain sister, the boring sister, the sister who entirely lacked vision and ambition. I endured the contempt when Valerie toasted to Chloe finding a man of true vision while pointedly ignoring my existence in the very same room. I cooked, I washed, I endured the contempt. I watched through the rain-streaked glass as Marcus poured another round of champagne for everyone. He was not just kicking me out into a terrible storm. He was actively moving them in to replace me. This had been entirely orchestrated. They had packed their bags and driven over here waiting for the exact moment Marcus threw me out like garbage. Marcus clapped Julian on the back with exaggerated brotherhood. He raised his glass and made an announcement. I could not hear the words through the thick, insulated glass, but I could read his lips, and I could see his expansive gestures. He pointed up the grand, sweeping staircase. He pointed directly toward the east wing of the mansion. He was giving them the master bedroom. He was literally handing over the most intimate space of my marriage to my spoiled sister and her fraudulent husband. Marcus wanted proximity to Julian. He desperately wanted to be the investment banker who funded the next massive tech unicorn and brought it to market. Julian knew exactly how to play him, feeding his massive ego with empty promises of stock options and board seats. Marcus was willing to sacrifice his own wife just to keep this fake tech genius under his roof and under his influence. And my mother was there to bless this entire sick arrangement. Valerie stood up from the velvet sofa. She smoothed down her silk blouse, the exact same silk blouse I had purchased for her last Christmas. She walked over to Marcus and pulled him into a deep, affectionate hug. She looked at him with the kind of overwhelming pride and adoration she had never once shown me in my entire 32 years of life. She patted his cheek like he was her own son. She was thanking him for taking in her golden child. She was congratulating him for finally cutting the dead weight. My heart hammered against my ribs, but it was not from the freezing cold. It was from a rage so pure and so absolute that it burned away every single trace of the submissive daughter I used to be. Valerie had always made her favoritism abundantly clear, but tonight was the ultimate betrayal. Chloe had always received the ballet lessons, the new cars, and the endless grace. I had received the chores, the harsh expectations, and the constant reminders that I was lucky a successful man like Marcus even looked twice at a plain girl like me. Valerie weaponized Marcus against me, and now she was weaponizing Julian against me too. Julian stepped forward and wrapped his arm around Chloe, planting a kiss on her cheek. Chloe giggled and leaned into him, looking around the massive living room with greedy, calculating eyes. She was already mentally redecorating my home. She was already claiming my space. She pointed at my favorite reading chair and made a dismissive gesture indicating to Julian that it needed to be thrown in the trash. Marcus nodded in agreement, eager to please them. They were openly celebrating my exile. They genuinely thought they had finally discarded the useless weight holding them back. They thought they had finally won the game. Valerie turned away from Marcus and walked slowly toward the massive bay window. The golden light from the chandelier illuminated her sharp features. She looked out into the darkness of the front yard. A bright flash of lightning tore across the sky, suddenly illuminating the entire property in stark white light. She saw me. We made direct eye contact through the thick glass and the pouring rain. I was standing less than 20 feet away, shivering uncontrollably, drenched to the bone, my clothes plastered to my skin. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me. I looked at the woman I had cared for when she was sick. The woman I had financially supported before Marcus and I even got married. She did not flinch. She did not gasp in horror. She did not drop her expensive crystal glass. She did not rush to the front door to save her own daughter from the freezing storm. Valerie simply stood there, safe and warm inside the mansion my hard work had helped secure. She looked right at my shivering frame, and then she smiled. It was a slow, satisfied, and deeply cruel smile. It was the smile of a woman who had finally gotten exactly what she wanted. She raised her wineglass slightly in my direction, a silent, mocking toast to my absolute destruction. Then she deliberately turned her back on me and walked back to join the warmth and laughter of the people she actually valued. I cooked, I washed, I endured the contempt, and this was my reward. I turned away from the glowing window. I did not look back at the mansion again. I left the cheap canvas suitcase sitting completely ruined in the mud. I did not need those old clothes anymore. I did not need that pathetic, submissive life anymore. I walked down the long and winding concrete driveway. My wet shoes squished loudly against the pavement with every single step. The severe storm raged on around me, but the chaotic noise of the thunder and the wind suddenly felt completely silent. I felt completely and utterly calm. A strange and terrifying clarity washed over my mind. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a failure because I did not wear designer brands or boast about my bank account at their elite dinner parties. They thought my quiet nature was proof of my incompetence. They had entirely mistaken my silence for submission. They had mistaken my patience for powerlessness. I walked past the ornate iron gates of our exclusive gated community. I stepped into the deep shadows of the tree-lined street outside the neighborhood. The rain continued to fall in heavy sheets, but my vision was perfectly clear. I knew exactly what I had to do. The time for being the good wife was over. The time for being the obedient daughter was dead and gone. I was about to show them exactly what happens when the person you throw into the storm turns out to be the one controlling the lightning. I walked with steady and deliberate steps away from the massive wrought iron gates of the exclusive community Marcus valued more than his own soul. The freezing rain continued to pour, but I no longer felt the cold. The heavy, relentless downpour felt like a baptism. It washed away the final lingering shreds of the submissive wife I had pretended to be for the last 5 years. I left behind the woman who kept her head down. I left behind the daughter who desperately sought the approval of a mother incapable of love. I walked into the dark shadows of the tree-lined avenue just beyond the neighborhood entrance, leaving the glowing streetlights and the illusions of my past life completely behind me. A few yards down the slick, wet road, a massive vehicle waited silently in the pitch-black night. It was an armored black Maybach. Its powerful engine hummed with a low and steady vibration that you could feel in the pavement before you could even hear it. The headlights were completely turned off to avoid drawing any unwanted attention from the private security patrols roaming the affluent neighborhood. The sleek, flawless exterior of the car swallowed the ambient light, making it look like a phantom lurking in the storm. As I approached the vehicle, the heavy rear door swung open immediately. A man dressed in a meticulously tailored dark charcoal suit stepped out. He did not rush. He moved with absolute precision and professional discipline. He opened a large black umbrella, holding it high over my head to shield me from the relentless assault of the rain. "Good evening, Madam Chairman," he said. His voice was calm and respectful, cutting cleanly through the chaotic noise of the storm. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of deep loyalty and unwavering respect. I stepped up into the luxurious leather interior of the Maybach. The heavy armored door closed solidly behind me, with a deeply satisfying thud. It instantly shut out the raging storm, the freezing wind, and the noise of the city completely. The cabin was incredibly warm and perfectly silent. The soundproofing was absolute, creating a secure sanctuary where I could finally breathe. My executive assistant sat quietly across from me in the plush rear-facing seat. She handed me a steaming warm towel and a thick cashmere blanket without saying a single word. I peeled off the soaking wet cotton sweater. I dried my face and wrapped myself in the heavy warmth of the expensive cashmere. In that enclosed and highly secure space, the meek and invisible wife died permanently. I shed my weak facade like a useless and suffocating second skin. I rolled my shoulders and let out a long, slow breath. I was no longer the submissive and boring partner Marcus thought he could easily throw away. I was no longer the plain sister who lacked vision. I was the anonymous founder and the absolute majority shareholder of Vanguard Holdings. I controlled a colossal real estate and financial acquisition empire that moved billions of dollars globally. I had spent the last decade building Vanguard from the ground up, hiding behind proxy executives and a labyrinth of corporate shell companies to protect my peace. I knew exactly how greedy and parasitic my mother and sister were. I knew that if they ever discovered my true wealth, they would stop at nothing to drain me dry. So I hid my power. I played the part of the quiet, unremarkable freelance designer. I let Marcus be the loud and arrogant face of our household. His massive ego provided the perfect camouflage for my invisible empire. He was so busy demanding the spotlight that he never once bothered to look at the shadows where I was quietly pulling all the strings. Marcus thought he was a titan of industry. He genuinely believed he was an untouchable and powerful investment banker. He loved to boast about his six-figure bonuses and his elite status in the corporate hierarchy. What Marcus did not know was that Vanguard Holdings had quietly executed a hostile takeover of the very investment bank that signed his massive paychecks. I sat on the invisible board that dictated his daily professional existence. Marcus thought he owned that massive brick mansion. He threw me out into the rain, boasting that his name was on the mortgage and his hard work paid for the luxury. He did not know that Vanguard Holdings held the deed to that entire exclusive subdivision. The commercial real estate branch of my empire had acquired the development debt 2 years ago. I literally owned the ground he was standing on. And Julian thought he was easily securing a massive $50 million venture capital loan through Marcus to fund his stolen tech startup. He strutted around my house acting like a brilliant pioneer. He did not know that the venture capital firm reviewing his fraudulent application was a direct subsidiary of Vanguard. I was the exact person who personally reviewed and had the sole power to approve or instantly revoke his entire funding. They thought they had pushed a helpless and dependent woman out into the terrible storm. They had absolutely no idea they had just awakened a hurricane that was about to level their entire existence. I reached into my leather bag resting on the seat beside me. I pulled out my highly encrypted satellite phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dark cabin. I dialed a highly secure private number. My chief financial officer answered on the very first ring. "Execute Protocol 0, I said. My voice was incredibly steady and cold. The raw emotion from the driveway was entirely gone, replaced by pure and calculated authority. "Yes, Madam Chairman," the voice on the other end replied without a single second of hesitation. "Awaiting your specific parameters. Freeze all personal and commercial credit lines associated with Marcus Vance," what it commanded. "Initiate the immediate recall of the mortgage on his primary residence, citing the breach of contract clause we buried in the acquisition paperwork. Block the massive capital disbursement scheduled for Julian and his tech startup. Flag his entire portfolio for immediate internal fraud review. I want every single financial artery connected to that house severed before sunrise. Do it right now." "It is already in motion, Madam Chairman. Consider their accounts locked." The phone call lasted exactly 10 seconds. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the empty seat. I leaned my head back against the plush leather headrest and closed my eyes. The engine of the Maybach purred silently as the driver navigated away from the neighborhood. Tomorrow morning, Marcus would wake up in the master bedroom with his stolen pride and his bloated ego. He would try to buy his morning coffee and his card would be declined. He would try to access his executive corporate accounts and find himself locked out of the entire banking system. He would march into his prestigious office demanding answers only to be met by a heavily armed corporate security team ready to escort him out of the building. Julian would wake up expecting his multi-million-dollar wire transfer to clear, only to find his fake company completely blacklisted by every major financial institution in the country. Chloe would try to go on a shopping spree to celebrate her new living arrangement and find herself holding nothing but worthless plastic. My mother Valerie would discover that the wealthy son-in-law she worshipped was now a massive financial liability, drowning in millions of dollars of instantly recalled debt. They wanted to worship money and status above their own family. They wanted to humiliate me and cast me aside because they thought I had zero value. Now they were going to learn the true cost of their arrogance. I opened my eyes and looked out the tinted window at the stormy Atlanta night. The rain was still coming down in heavy, unrelenting sheets, but I was perfectly dry. "Drive," I told my chauffeur. The armored Maybach glided smoothly into the darkness, leaving the neighborhood and my old life behind forever. Tomorrow morning the sun would eventually rise on Atlanta, but for Marcus, Chloe, Julian, and Valerie, the real and terrifying storm was just beginning. The morning sun broke through the heavy storm clouds over Atlanta, casting a brilliant and deceptive light across the sprawling estate. The fierce storm had finally passed, leaving the manicured lawns looking vibrant and fresh. Inside the massive custom kitchen of the mansion, the atmosphere was equally bright and utterly sickening. I did not need to be physically present in the room to know exactly how the morning unfolded. My private security team had already rerouted the internal surveillance feeds of the property directly to my secure tablet. I sat in my penthouse downtown, sipping my black coffee, and watching the high-definition betrayal play out in real time. It was like watching a perfectly scripted comedy about four absolute fools who had no idea they were already dead. Chloe was the first to enter the kitchen. She paraded into the room wearing my expensive silk robe. It was the very same robe I had purchased during a private trip to Milan. She did not even have the decency to wash it first. She simply slipped it on and claimed it as her own. She glided across the imported Italian marble floors, acting like she was the new legitimate lady of the manor. She did not bother to cook, of course. I was the one who used to wake up at dawn to prepare Marcus his highly specific organic meals. Instead, Chloe had ordered a lavish catered breakfast spread from an exclusive Buckhead bistro. There were heavy silver platters piled high with smoked salmon, fresh truffles, artisanal pastries, and imported caviar. She arranged the extravagant spread on the massive quartz kitchen island, preening for an audience of none. Julian strolled in next. He wore an obscenely expensive cashmere sweater and a pair of casual designer loafers that Marcus had likely purchased for him. He walked with the exaggerated swagger of a man who firmly believed he was the next great pioneer of the modern technological age. He grabbed a fresh pastry and took a massive bite, chewing loudly while leaning against the expensive countertops. He began talking immediately, spouting a constant stream of meaningless Silicon Valley buzzwords. He talked about synergy and blockchain integration and disrupting the financial ecosystem. He waved his hands expansively, painting a picture of a $50 million empire that existed entirely in his own delusional mind. I watched his mouth move on the screen, and I actually smiled. Julian could not even write a basic line of code. His entire software startup was just a stolen user interface wrapped in a fraudulent business proposal. But in that sunlit kitchen, he was playing the role of the conquering hero. Marcus finally made his grand entrance. He descended the sweeping staircase looking incredibly rested and painfully smug. He had slept deeply and peacefully in my bed, completely unbothered by the fact that he had thrown his wife out into a freezing and violent storm just hours earlier. He wore a crisp white dress shirt and custom-tailored trousers. He walked into the kitchen and greeted Julian with a loud and enthusiastic handshake. He pulled Chloe into a brief side hug, treating my younger sister like a prized acquisition. Marcus walked over to the built-in wine fridge and pulled out a bottle of vintage champagne. He popped the cork with a loud celebratory crack. He poured 4 generous glasses of mimosas, mixing the expensive champagne with fresh orange juice. He was ready to toast to his newly purified life. He genuinely believed he had finally cut away the dead weight that was holding back his glorious ascent to the top of the Atlanta social ladder. Then my mother Valerie arrived. She walked into the kitchen radiating absolute triumph. She took her seat at the head of the large mahogany breakfast table, demanding the position of ultimate respect. Marcus immediately brought her a crystal glass filled with the mimosa. Valerie took a long and satisfied sip. She looked around the beautiful kitchen and let out a dramatic sigh of pure contentment. She looked at Marcus with eyes full of overwhelming adoration. "You are truly a blessing to this family, Marcus," she announced loudly. Her voice echoed through the high-definition audio feed and scraped directly against my eardrums. "You are a man of true vision and exceptional strength. I always knew you were destined for greatness. It just took you a little while to realize what was holding you back." Marcus smiled modestly, taking a delicate bite of caviar. "I appreciate that, Valerie," he replied. "It was a difficult decision, but a highly necessary one. A man in my position simply cannot afford to have a partner who lacks ambition." Valerie scoffed, waving her hand dismissively in the air. "Oh, please do not even mention her name in this beautiful house. Nia is an absolute disgrace to our family lineage. I spent my entire life trying to mold her into a woman of substance, and she chose to be painfully ordinary. She has no style. She has no grace. She has absolutely no business acumen. She was dragging you down, Marcus. She was dragging all of us down with her pathetic and small-minded mentality. Good riddance to bad rubbish, I say." I watched my mother systematically tear my character to shreds while eating the food I used to prepare and sitting in the house I legally owned. The sheer shamelessness of it was almost poetic. Valerie looked over at Julian, who was nodding along in enthusiastic agreement. "And you, Julian," she beamed, pointing her perfectly manicured finger at the fraudulent white tech bro standing in my kitchen. "You and Chloe are going to conquer the world together. A $50 million project. I can barely comprehend the magnitude of your genius. You are going to make the family name incredibly proud. You have my absolute blessing." The bitter irony of her statement was absolutely delicious. She was praising a parasitic con artist while fiercely condemning the actual billionaire who shared her blood. They sat around that table laughing and celebrating their collective victory. Chloe began complaining about the decor in the living room. She told Marcus that my taste in art was entirely too boring and depressing. She suggested they tear down the custom-commissioned paintings I had curated and replace them with something much more modern and flashy. Marcus agreed immediately, promising to give Chloe his exclusive black credit card so she could completely redecorate the entire first floor that very afternoon. He told her to spare absolutely no expense because they deserved to live in a space that reflected their high-value status. They were completely intoxicated by their own false narrative. They were a circle of toxic narcissists feeding endlessly on each other's inflated egos. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting on a massive financial landmine that had already been triggered. They were chewing on expensive smoked salmon that was purchased on a credit line that no longer existed. They were making grand plans to redecorate a mansion that was currently moving through an expedited and aggressive foreclosure process. They were toasting to a $50 million venture capital fund that had been permanently erased from the global banking system just 8 hours prior. I watched Marcus raise his crystal glass one more time. To new beginnings, he declared, his voice ringing with absolute arrogance and certainty. To cutting the dead weight and rising to the very top of this city. To family, he added, looking directly at Julian and Valerie. The real family. They all clinked their glasses together in a sickening display of unity. The sharp ringing sound of the expensive crystal echoed loudly through the kitchen. It was the absolute sound of complete complacency. They did not spare a single passing thought for my safety. They did not express a fraction of a second of guilt or remorse for leaving me to freeze in the dark. They only felt a profound and deeply arrogant relief. They were so deeply blinded by their own greed and their own self-importance that they could not see the massive shadow looming directly over their heads. They thought they had successfully manipulated the system to elevate themselves into royalty. I leaned back in my leather desk chair and locked my tablet screen. The show in the kitchen was over and the real entertainment was about to begin. They had enjoyed their illusory and lavish breakfast. They had basked in the warm morning sun and fed their bloated egos with lies and stolen champagne. Now it was time for them to step outside into the real world. Now it was time for them to try and spend the money they thought they had securely in their pockets. Marcus was planning to drive Chloe to the luxury car dealership to buy her a brand new sports car. Julian was planning to check his secure banking portal to verify his massive wire transfer had cleared. They were walking straight into a meticulously designed financial slaughterhouse, and I had the absolute best seat in the entire building to watch the carnage unfold. Julian strutted out of the kitchen and made his way directly down the grand hallway toward my private study. He carried his crystal glass of mimosa in one hand and his sleek silver laptop in the other. He pushed open the heavy double doors of the office I had personally designed. The room featured custom-built mahogany bookshelves, a massive antique desk, and a carefully curated collection of rare architectural texts. Julian did not appreciate any of it. He walked in and immediately claimed the space as his own personal command center. He dropped his laptop onto my pristine desk and threw his expensive leather loafers right on top of the polished wood, crossing his ankles with supreme arrogance. He sank back into my ergonomic leather chair and let out a long, satisfied sigh. He looked around the room with the entitlement of a man who believed the entire world owed him total luxury simply for existing. Marcus followed him into the study a few moments later, completely oblivious to the blatant disrespect Julian was showing to my property. Marcus was practically vibrating with desperate energy. He leaned against the doorway, crossing his arms and trying to project the image of a powerful financier, but he just looked like an eager and pathetic subordinate. So Julian, Marcus said, his voice dripping with forced casualness. The $50 million disbursement is scheduled to hit your holding account by 10 this morning. Our underwriting team pushed it through the final compliance checks late last night, just as I promised. You should see the wire transfer clear any minute now. Julian took a slow, arrogant sip of his mimosa. He did not even bother to look up at Marcus immediately. He kept his eyes locked on his laptop screen, typing a few keys with exaggerated importance. "Excellent, Marcus," he replied, his tone dripping with utter condescension. "I knew I could count on you to handle the tedious bureaucratic details. Once that 50 million clears, we are going to revolutionize the global financial ecosystem. I have international investors lined up waiting to see our proof of concept. But I wanted to give you the ground floor opportunity. I wanted my family to get the first bite of the apple. You are going to be a very rich and very legendary man, Marcus." Marcus practically beamed at the empty compliment, his chest puffed out with absolute pride. He thanked Julian profusely and backed out of the room, closing the heavy doors to let the genius work in peace. I watched this entire sickening exchange on my security feed, and I felt a wave of pure revulsion wash over me. Marcus was a seasoned investment banker who ruthlessly tore apart corporate portfolios every single day, but his desperate greed had completely blinded him to the most obvious and pathetic con artist standing right in his living room. Julian was not a tech genius. He was an absolute fraud. He was an empty shell of a man wrapped in expensive cashmere and unearned confidence. I knew this for an absolute fact because 3 months ago, when Chloe first introduced him to the family, I ran a comprehensive background check through Vanguard Holdings' intelligence division. What I found was beyond embarrassing. Julian had never written a single line of viable code in his entire life. His glorious billion-dollar tech startup was nothing more than a digital mirage. It was a stolen open-source user interface slapped onto a non-existent back-end database. He had paid a cheap freelance developer overseas exactly $2,000 to build a wireframe that looked pretty on a presentation screen. There was no proprietary algorithm. There was no revolutionary blockchain integration. There was absolutely nothing but stolen ideas and empty Silicon Valley buzzwords. Yet Julian marched into my family and played them all for absolute fools. He manipulated their deep-seated insecurities and their desperate thirst for elite status. He recognized that Marcus had a massive chip on his shoulder. Marcus desperately wanted to be seen as a visionary creator, rather than just a wealthy bank employee processing other people's money. Julian exploited that exact weakness. He dangled a phantom seat on his non-existent board of directors. He offered Marcus the illusion of creating a historic tech unicorn. In exchange, Julian demanded a $50 million seed loan with zero collateral. He convinced Marcus to bypass the strict risk assessment protocols of the bank. Marcus put his entire professional reputation, his banking license, and his personal liability on the line to force that massive loan through the system. Marcus committed severe financial fraud just to win the approval of a white con artist who secretly despised him. I sat in my penthouse watching Julian alone in my study. As soon as Marcus left the room, Julian's fake professional demeanor vanished completely. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. He leaned back in my chair, putting his feet up higher on my desk. He was calling one of his equally parasitic friends. "You would not believe this setup, man." Julian laughed loudly into the phone. The audio feed captured his obnoxious voice perfectly. "I am sitting in a $10 million mansion right now. The brother-in-law actually did it. He pushed the 50 million through his bank. I did not even have to provide a working prototype. These people are so desperate for validation, they just handed me the keys to the vault." The voice on the other end of the phone muttered something, and Julian laughed even harder. "Oh, totally," he replied. "The wife Chloe is clueless. She just likes having a tech founder on her arm to show off at her little country club luncheons. She packed all my bags last night while I watched television. The whole family is a complete joke. The banker husband threw his own wife out into a thunderstorm just so I could have the master bedroom. I did not even have to ask. They are practically begging me to take their money. Once that wire clears, I am transferring 30 million to the offshore accounts, and we are taking the private jet to Monaco by the end of the week. Let the banker deal with the fallout. It is his signature on the approval forms anyway." I listened to his vile confession and felt my blood run completely ice cold. He was not just stealing money. He was openly mocking the very people who were sacrificing everything to worship him. He felt entirely superior to Marcus and Valerie and Chloe. He viewed them as gullible stepping stones provided by the universe for his personal enrichment. He operated with the terrifying audacity of a mediocre white man who had never faced a single consequence in his entire privileged life. He truly believed he was untouchable. He believed he was the smartest person in the room simply because he had managed to swindle a desperate and greedy family. But Julian had made one fatal and catastrophic miscalculation. He thought Marcus was the final authority holding the purse strings. He thought his $50 million heist was safely secured behind the walls of a major corporate bank. He had no idea that the corporate bank was merely a subsidiary of a much larger and much more ruthless financial predator. He had no idea that the silent, invisible woman he had mocked and displaced was the apex predator waiting in the deep water. Julian ended his phone call and tossed the device onto my desk. He rubbed his hands together with greedy anticipation. He opened a new tab on his silver laptop and navigated to the highly secure corporate banking portal. He typed in his credentials with rapid, excited keystrokes. He was logging in to verify that his new holding account reflected the $50 million balance. He was checking the trap he thought he had successfully sprung. He leaned closer to the screen, a greedy and arrogant smile stretching across his face. He watched the loading icon spin in the center of the display. He was waiting for the digital validation of his grand deception. He was waiting for the numbers that would fund his escape to Monaco and leave my family in absolute ruin. He stared at the screen, completely unaware that the loading icon was not processing a deposit. It was processing his permanent financial execution. While Julian stared at his frozen computer screen, waiting for a digital validation that would never arrive, Marcus was busy preparing for his own magnificent and highly public performance. He drove Chloe to the most exclusive, exotic car dealership in the heart of Buckhead. It was a pristine glass showroom filled with limited edition European sports cars. The building practically hummed with the scent of expensive leather and polished metal. Chloe walked through the automatic sliding doors, acting exactly like a member of a royal family. She wore her oversized designer sunglasses indoors and pointed her manicured fingers at vehicles that cost more than most people would earn in a decade. Marcus walked right behind her with his chest puffed out and his head held high. He was absolutely reveling in his role as the wealthy and powerful provider. He completely ignored the fact that he was buying a luxury vehicle for his sister-in-law just hours after throwing his actual wife into a freezing storm. He only cared about the attention and the fawning respect of the dealership staff. The general manager of the dealership recognized Marcus immediately. Marcus was a known investment banker who had leased several cars from them in the past. The manager rushed over, offering them imported sparkling water and bowing his head with practiced subservience. Chloe did not even bother to look at the price tags. She walked directly toward a stunning cherry-red convertible sitting on a raised, rotating platform in the absolute center of the showroom floor. It was a viciously expensive machine, with a custom white leather interior and a massive 12-cylinder engine designed entirely for showing off. "I want this one," she announced loudly, making sure the other wealthy patrons in the showroom heard her perfectly clear voice. "I want to drive it out of here right now." Marcus did not hesitate. He did not negotiate the price or ask about the financing terms. He wanted the audience to see his massive wealth and his ultimate power. He wanted everyone in that building to know he was a titan of industry. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his heavy titanium black credit card. "Wrap it up," he told the manager with an arrogant smirk. "Put the title entirely in her name." The general manager smiled widely and took the heavy metal card with both hands. He escorted them to a sleek glass desk in the middle of the showroom to process the immediate transaction. Marcus leaned casually against the glass desk, sipping his sparkling water and waiting for the inevitable praise from the staff. The manager swiped the heavy titanium card through the encrypted terminal. The machine processed the transaction for a few seconds. Then it emitted a sharp and piercing beep. A bright red error message flashed across the digital display. Transaction declined. The general manager frowned slightly and cleared his throat. I apologize, Mr. Vance, he said politely, keeping his tone highly respectful. It seems there is a security block on the card. This happens quite frequently with purchases of this magnitude. Your bank is simply protecting your assets from potential fraud. Marcus laughed a loud and dismissive sound. Of course, he said, waving his hand as if the minor inconvenience was beneath him. The fraud department is always overly sensitive. Just run this one instead. He pulled out a platinum corporate card linked directly to his elite executive account at the bank. The manager took the second card and swiped it through the machine. The terminal processed for 3 agonizing seconds. It beeped again, much louder this time. Another bright red error message illuminated the screen. Transaction declined. Code 04. Account frozen. The polite and subservient smile on the general manager's face began to slip. The atmosphere in the showroom immediately shifted from celebratory to incredibly awkward. Chloe let out a loud, dramatic sigh of extreme annoyance. She tapped her designer heels against the polished floor. Marcus, what are you doing? She whined loudly, drawing the attention of several other wealthy customers examining cars nearby. Just pay for the car so we can leave. I want to drive my new car right now. Marcus felt a cold bead of sweat form on the back of his neck. His perfectly constructed facade of unlimited power was actively cracking in a highly public arena. He ripped his expensive leather wallet out of his pocket and slapped 3 different credit cards down onto the glass desk. There was a gold card, a secondary platinum card, and a high-limit travel card. Try all of them, he demanded, his voice rapidly losing its smooth and arrogant tone. Just run the damn cards. The manager picked up the plastic with noticeable hesitation. He swiped the first one. Declined. He swiped the second one. Declined. He swiped the final card. The machine beeped a long, continuous, and highly obnoxious tone. The digital display flashed a message that made the manager physically step backward. Card confiscated by issuer. Please retain physical card immediately. The manager looked down at the plastic in his hand and then looked up at Marcus. The fawning subservience was completely gone from his eyes. It was instantly replaced by a look of deep and humiliating suspicion. He placed a protective hand over the confiscated card and slid the others back across the desk. I am incredibly sorry, sir, the manager said, his voice turning distinctly cold and highly professional. But every single one of your accounts has been completely frozen. We cannot proceed with this transaction. I am going to have to ask you to step away from the vehicle. Marcus stared at the manager in absolute shock. The elite ego of a managing director was suffering its very first catastrophic blow. This was impossible. He was a multimillionaire. He was a senior executive at one of the most powerful financial institutions in the entire state of Georgia. Do you have any idea who I am? Marcus shouted, his voice echoing harshly off the glass walls of the showroom. I process corporate acquisitions larger than your entire pathetic dealership. There is simply a glitch in your broken system. Do you know how much money I make? He pulled out his smartphone with violently shaking hands. He dialed his highly exclusive concierge banking line. This was a dedicated phone number reserved solely for ultra-high net worth clients. It was contractually guaranteed to be answered within 2 rings by a dedicated personal wealth manager. Marcus held the phone to his ear and waited for the familiar voice of his subservient banker to fix this humiliating mistake. The line rang once. It rang twice. It rang a 3rd time. Marcus felt his heart drop like a heavy stone directly into his stomach. The dedicated concierge line never rang more than twice. It rang for a 4th time before abruptly switching to an automated dead tone. The call completely disconnected. Marcus stared at his phone screen with wide, panicked eyes. He dialed his personal wealth manager directly on his private cell phone. The call went straight to a generic voicemail box that stated the number was no longer in service. He frantically dialed the main branch of his own investment bank. The automated system placed him on an endless hold, playing cheap elevator music into his ear. He was entirely locked out of his own kingdom. I was watching this entire pathetic display unfold from the massive wall of monitors in my penthouse office. Vanguard Holdings owned the global security company that provided the high-definition surveillance cameras for that exact car dealership. I sat back in my leather chair and watched Marcus pacing back and forth in the showroom with the phone pressed tightly to his sweating ear. I saw the absolute terror bleeding directly into his eyes. His chest heaved as panic set in. He was trapped in a total financial blackout and he was utterly powerless to stop it. It was immensely satisfying to watch the man who thought he was a god be reduced to a sweating, panicked mess over pieces of declined plastic. Chloe crossed her arms over her chest and threw a massive temper tantrum right in the middle of the luxury showroom. She stomped her foot and screamed that Marcus had humiliated her and ruined her entire day. She demanded to know why he was pretending to be rich if he could not even buy her a simple convertible. Her shrill voice carried across the room, drawing stares and whispers from the affluent crowd. The golden child was turning on her provider the exact moment the money stopped flowing. The general manager signaled silently to the dealership security guard. A large man in a dark uniform began walking purposefully toward Marcus and Chloe. "Sir, I must ask you to lower your voice and exit the premises immediately," the manager ordered firmly. "You are disturbing our actual paying customers. Please leave right now before we are forced to physically escort you out of the building." Marcus stood frozen in place. The man who had ruthlessly evicted his own wife into a freezing storm was now being thrown out of a car dealership in broad daylight. His face burned with a deep and overwhelming shame. The humiliation was absolute and entirely public. He grabbed Chloe by the arm and dragged her screaming and protesting toward the exit. He pushed through the automatic sliding doors and stepped out into the harsh morning sun. He had absolutely no new sports car. He had absolutely no working credit cards. He had absolutely no idea that his precious banking career had just been permanently terminated by the very woman he discarded. He was entirely broke, and the invisible walls of his stolen life were rapidly closing in around him. High above the sweltering streets of Atlanta, the air was perfectly still and absolutely silent. I stood behind a massive wall of reinforced floor-to-ceiling glass, looking down at the sprawling metropolis spread out endlessly beneath my feet. The Vanguard Holdings Tower was the tallest and most imposing skyscraper in the entire financial district. It was a towering monolith of black glass and brushed steel that pierced the clouds like a spear. This was my fortress. This was the absolute apex of the corporate food chain, and I was the apex predator. I watched the tiny lines of traffic moving sluggishly along the highways miles below. Somewhere down there in that chaotic and miserable gridlock, Marcus was sweating inside his tailored suit. He was likely hyperventilating in the passenger seat of a rideshare, trying to figure out why his entire world had just violently evaporated. I took a slow, deep breath of the perfectly filtered, climate-controlled air. The scent of polished mahogany, expensive leather, and fresh orchids filled the expansive space. My private office occupied the entire top floor of the tower. It was a sprawling sanctuary of ultimate power designed entirely to intimidate anyone who dared to step off the private biometric elevator. The floor was laid with seamless slabs of imported black marble that reflected the skyline like a dark mirror. My desk sat in the exact center of the room. It was a colossal piece of petrified wood suspended in dark resin that weighed over a ton. There were no messy stacks of paper. There were no framed family photos. There was only a sleek integrated command console that connected me directly to global financial markets across 3 different continents. This room did not merely represent wealth. It represented the kind of terrifying invisible power that could bankrupt a small country before lunchtime. I turned away from the panoramic view and walked slowly toward my desk. The terrified and submissive woman who had cooked meals and washed clothes in that suburban mansion was completely dead and buried. I had shed that pathetic disguise forever. Today, I wore my true skin. I was dressed in a bespoke midnight blue power suit tailored to absolute perfection. The sharp, aggressive lines of the blazer armored my shoulders, and the blood-red silk lining whispered with every calculated movement I made. My hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless style. My posture was perfectly straight, reflecting a spine made of absolute steel. I slid into the high-backed leather chair and tapped the surface of my desk. 3 massive curved monitors rose silently from the smooth surface. The screens flared to life, illuminating my face with the cold blue light of endless financial data. For 5 agonizing years, I had hidden this version of myself. I had muted my brilliance to stroke the fragile ego of a mediocre man. I had played the role of the quiet, uninteresting wife because I valued my peace over public recognition. I had allowed them to look down on me. I had allowed them to treat me like a mindless servant. Now I was looking down at them from a height they could not even comprehend. They had mistaken my intentional silence for profound weakness. They were about to learn that the quietest people in the room are usually the ones holding the executioner's axe. I accessed the highly restricted servers of the investment bank Marcus worked for. Because Vanguard Holdings was the anonymous majority shareholder of the institution, I had unrestricted God-level clearance to every single internal document. I pulled up Marcus Vance and opened his complete financial portfolio. I did not just freeze his accounts last night. I instructed my forensic accounting team to completely dissect his entire life. The reports on my screen were absolutely damning. Marcus projected the image of a fabulously wealthy titan of industry, but the reality was a pathetic and crumbling house of cards. His entire existence was built on high-interest debt and desperate leverage. He had taken out massive secret loans just to maintain his flashy lifestyle. He had remortgaged the mansion 3 times to pay for his country club memberships, his imported suits, and his expensive networking dinners. He was drowning in hidden liabilities. The deep irony was that Vanguard Holdings had purchased the underlying debt of every single one of those loans. I owned the car he drove. I owned the expensive watch on his wrist. I owned the very bed he slept in. But the most spectacular violation was staring back at me in bright red digital ink. To push Julian's fraudulent $50 million loan through the system, Marcus had bypassed 3 separate layers of mandatory compliance checks. He had overridden the strict risk management protocols. To satisfy the bank's automated security algorithms, Marcus had secretly attached his own personal portfolio as the primary guarantor for the venture capital seed money. He had literally bet his entire life and his professional license on a fraudulent white tech bro he met barely 3 months ago. It was a level of catastrophic stupidity that almost defied logic. Marcus had committed severe corporate fraud to fund his own sister-in-law. He had handed me the exact legal weapon I needed to destroy him completely and legally. I swiped my finger across the screen and pulled up the secondary dossier. Julian, the golden boy. The brilliant visionary that my mother Valerie worshipped with sickening devotion. My corporate espionage team had spent the last 8 hours ripping Julian's entire digital footprint to absolute shreds. The report they compiled was a masterpiece of criminal incompetence. Julian's glorious tech startup was not just an empty shell. It was a highly illegal operation built entirely on stolen intellectual property. He had ripped the core source code directly from a proprietary database belonging to a defunct European startup. He had copied the algorithms line by line without even bothering to change the developer notes in the margins. He had then set up a network of illegal offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands, designed specifically to funnel investor money out of the country the exact second it hit his account. He was planning a massive hit-and-run wire fraud operation. He was going to take the $50 million Marcus secured for him and vanish into thin air, leaving my husband to take the absolute fall for the missing funds. Julian thought he was pulling off the heist of the century. He thought he was playing a wealthy black family for absolute fools. He had no idea that every single keystroke he made on my home network had been tracked, logged, and verified by my security team. I had all the proof. I had the server logs, the offshore account numbers, and the stolen source code repositories. I had enough hard, undeniable evidence to put Julian in a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool, smooth surface of my desk. I stared at the cascading lines of data exposing their absolute ruin. They had evicted me into a freezing storm to make room for a pathetic criminal and a desperate fraud. They had openly celebrated my destruction while drinking champagne bought on my secret credit. They wanted to be ruthless. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of power and domination. I smiled in the quiet solitude of my impenetrable fortress. It was a cold, calculating smile that promised absolute devastation. I tapped a button on my console connecting me directly to the head of my elite legal division. Draft the final eviction notices, I commanded, my voice echoing with terrifying calm. Prepare the criminal referral packages for the Federal Bureau of Investigation regarding the wire fraud and the stolen intellectual property. I want the total liquidation of Marcus Vance's personal and professional assets initiated by close of business today. Do not leave them a single penny. Do not leave them a single avenue of escape. I want them stripped bare. The machine of destruction was fully operational. The trap was perfectly set, and the heavy steel doors were locked from the outside. They were coming to my tower tomorrow, and they were going to burn. I did not want a swift execution. A quick death was far too merciful for the people who had locked me outside in a freezing storm and celebrated my demise. I wanted a slow and methodical strangulation. I wanted them to feel the financial oxygen leaving their lungs one agonizing breath at a time. I sat in my leather chair surrounded by the glowing screens of my command center and tapped the secure communication line to my chief legal counsel. Send the physical notices, I commanded, my voice echoing with terrifying calm. I want the aggressive foreclosure documents delivered to the front door of the estate immediately. Ensure the process servers are highly visible and do not break eye contact. Then cut the data cord on the venture capital platform. Alert the secondary syndicate funds. Watch the dominoes fall. 10 miles away in the affluent bubble of Buckhead, the morning was unfolding into a spectacular nightmare. My security feed showed my mother Valerie and my sister Chloe lounging in the grand living room. They were still wearing their expensive silk pajamas, drinking imported espresso, and browsing luxury catalogs on their high-definition tablets. They were entirely oblivious to the crosshairs locked directly on their foreheads. They were actively laughing about what color to paint my former bedroom, discussing whether they should tear down the walls to make a massive walk-in closet. The heavy brass knocker on the massive front door echoed loudly through the mansion. Chloe, annoyed by the sudden interruption, sent the housekeeper to answer it. Instead of a friendly delivery driver, two heavily armed corporate process servers stepped directly into the grand foyer. They wore sharp black suits and carried themselves with absolute uncompromising authority. They did not carry small, discreet envelopes. They carried thick legal binders stamped with urgent red foreclosure warnings. Valerie stood up from the velvet sofa, demanding to know the meaning of this blatant intrusion. She puffed out her chest, attempting to leverage her fake upper-class status, barking orders at the men to leave her property immediately. The lead process server did not even blink. He completely ignored her manufactured outrage and handed her the heavy binder. "Notice of immediate default and aggressive asset seizure," he announced. His voice was incredibly loud, echoing in the very hallway where Marcus had thrown my suitcase into the mud. "The primary mortgage holder, Vanguard Holdings, has recalled the entire debt due to fraudulent applicant activity and extreme breach of contract. You have exactly 48 hours to completely vacate the premises before law enforcement physically removes all occupants and seizes all high-value assets within the property walls." Valerie dropped her espresso cup. The delicate porcelain shattered instantly against the imported marble floor, sending dark liquid splashing across her expensive slippers. Chloe snatched the documents from the process server with trembling hands. Her eyes frantically scanned the dense legal jargon, her limited comprehension struggling to grasp the absolute finality of the printed words. She tried to yell at the men, telling them her husband was a billionaire tech founder, and this was a massive mistake. The process servers simply turned around and walked out, leaving the front door wide open. The house was not just in default, it was actively being repossessed, with zero opportunity for renegotiation. The sanctuary they had violently stolen from me was actively dissolving beneath their feet. Chloe frantically dialed Marcus, but her call went straight to a disconnected tone. The panic began to set in deeply. It was a cold and creeping dread that paralyzed them both in the center of the grand foyer. They were staring at the absolute end of their lavish existence. At the exact same moment across the city, Julian was standing in his rented high-rise startup office in the prestigious Midtown Tech District. It was a massive open-concept space with exposed brick walls, expensive ping-pong tables, custom neon signs, and absolutely zero actual employees. He had signed a massive 5-year commercial lease using the phantom $50 million loan as aggressive leverage. He stood in front of a massive digital dashboard that tracked his investor commitments in real time. He was holding a crystal glass of expensive scotch, celebrating his ultimate deception. He watched the screen waiting for the final confirmation of his wire transfer. He was already planning which offshore account would receive the first $10 million and which luxury yacht he would charter in Monaco. Instead, the digital dashboard violently refreshed. The primary $50 million anchor investment flashed a bright, aggressive red. The status changed from processing to permanently revoked. Julian choked on his scotch, coughing loudly and dropping his heavy crystal glass onto the polished concrete floor. He slammed his hands onto his mechanical keyboard, frantically refreshing the browser over and over again. He thought it was a simple network error. He thought the bank was just verifying a standard security protocol. He muttered curses under his breath, convinced he could easily fix the glitch. But the bright red revoked status remained burned into the screen, mocking his utter incompetence. Then the secondary disaster struck with lethal precision. Julian had leveraged the promise of Marcus's $50 million bank loan to secure an additional $20 million from independent angel investors and smaller syndicate funds. Vanguard Holdings controlled the back-end data syndication for those specific investment portfolios. I gave the command to release a targeted financial bulletin to every single one of Julian's secondary investors. The bulletin contained a highly redacted but perfectly clear forensic analysis, exposing his company as a hollow, empty shell built entirely on stolen source code and illegal wire fraud schemes. The reaction from this market was instantaneous and brutally violent. The digital dashboard in Julian's office began flashing wildly like a catastrophic emergency siren. One by one, the secondary investor commitments vanished. A $2 million pledge from a prominent venture capitalist turned red and disappeared. A $5 million syndicate fund withdrew their capital instantly, triggering an automated breach of contract penalty. The numbers plummeted in real time. 50 million dropped to zero. 20 million dropped to negative balances. 10 million dropped to zero. Within exactly 4 minutes, Julian's entire $70 million fraudulent empire was completely erased from physical existence. Julian grabbed his sleek silver laptop and hurled it violently across the room. The expensive machine smashed into the exposed brick wall, shattering into a dozen useless pieces of plastic and wire. He screamed. It was a loud, guttural sound of pure terror and absolute helpless rage. He tore at his perfectly styled hair, knocking over a massive glass whiteboard filled with stolen technical jargon and fake projection charts. His smartphone began ringing incessantly on the desk. It was his desperate commercial landlord demanding the 6-figure security deposit. It was his panicked offshore fixers warning him that their secure accounts were suddenly being aggressively audited by federal banking regulators. Every single notification that popped up on his screen was another nail in his coffin. The invisible walls were rapidly closing in, crushing him from all sides. Julian kicked a glass coffee table, shattering it completely into sharp, jagged shards. He fell to his knees in the middle of the massive, empty office surrounded by broken glass and the absolute wreckage of his criminal ambition. He frantically picked up his phone and dialed Marcus, but just like Chloe, he was met with a dead, disconnected line. The powerful investment banker he had manipulated was currently fighting for his own professional survival. Julian was totally exposed. He was a fraud, a thief, and a failure completely stripped of his unearned confidence. He curled his hands into fists and pounded the concrete floor, screaming until his voice went completely hoarse and his throat burned. I watched Julian sobbing on the floor through the covert security cameras I had secretly installed in his rented office space months ago. I watched Valerie and Chloe hyperventilating in the grand foyer of my mansion through the home security feeds. The synchronized financial siege was executing with absolutely flawless precision. I was systematically dismantling their stolen reality piece by agonizing peace. They were choking on the severe consequences of their own boundless greed. They had absolutely no money left to spend. They had absolutely no shelter left to claim. They had absolutely no power left to wield. The invisible noose I had placed around their collective necks was pulling tighter with every passing second, completely cutting off their financial air supply. The slow, deliberate choke was far more devastating than any swift execution could ever be. I sat in my quiet, impenetrable tower, looking at the glowing monitors that displayed their utter ruin. I sipped my black coffee and watched them suffocate in the very traps they had so eagerly built for themselves. My personal cell phone vibrated violently against the smooth surface of my petrified wood desk. It was not the highly encrypted corporate satellite phone I used to command my financial empire. It was the old, cheap device I had kept active for exactly one reason. I wanted to know exactly how long it would take for their towering arrogance to crack under the crushing weight of absolute poverty. I glanced at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. Valerie was calling me less than 24 hours after she smiled and happily watched Marcus throw my luggage into a freezing mud puddle. I tapped the green accept button and placed the phone on speaker mode. I set it down gently next to my keyboard. I did not say a single word. I did not offer a greeting. I simply let the line open and allowed her desperation to fill my perfectly silent office. "Nia, thank goodness you answered," Valerie said. Her voice was breathy and fast. She was attempting to sound sweet and maternal, but the raw panic bleeding through her vocal cords was unmistakable. She was panting slightly as she paced back and forth across the marble foyer of the mansion I was actively foreclosing on. "We have had a slight misunderstanding this morning. Marcus is experiencing a temporary banking issue. A minor clerical error, really. The bank froze his accounts by mistake, and it is causing a ridiculous delay." I sat back in my leather chair and watched her on the high-definition security feed. She was clutching her phone with white knuckles. She was trying to maintain the illusion of control while holding a massive foreclosure document in her other hand. "I need you to wire your emergency savings to my account immediately," Valerie demanded. Her tone shifted rapidly from fake sweetness to harsh expectation. "I know you have a few $1,000s tucked away from those little freelance design projects you do. Send every single penny right now so Marcus can clear up this annoying red tape. Chloe is very upset. Julian needs his startup funds released today, and Marcus needs liquid cash to hire a lawyer to fix this bank error." I continued to stare at the phone. I did not utter a single syllable. I let the absolute silence stretch across the cellular connection. It was a heavy and suffocating silence that offered absolutely zero comfort and zero compliance. "Are you listening to me?" Valerie shouted. Her voice cracked, losing all of its manufactured upper-class elegance. "You owe this family Nia. Marcus put a roof over your head for 5 years. He fed you. He clothed you. It is your absolute duty as a wife and a daughter to hand over your money when we need it. Stop being a stubborn and selfish child. Send the money right now, or I swear I will never forgive you for abandoning us." She was threatening to withhold her love, as if her love had ever been anything other than a toxic weapon. She wanted the daughter she had gleefully thrown into a storm to suddenly become her financial savior. She believed she could simply demand my obedience, and I would instantly fold. She was demanding the meager savings of a woman she thought was broke. She had absolutely no idea she was demanding pocket change from a billionaire who held her entire existence in the palm of her hand. I watched her on the screen. She was sweating. Her perfect hair was becoming disheveled. She was waiting for me to apologize. She was waiting for me to beg for her approval. I reached forward and pressed the red button on the screen. I disconnected the call. I offered no explanation. I offered no anger. I offered nothing but the sharp and final click of a dead line. My silence was a perfectly sharpened blade, and I had just driven it straight through her desperate illusion of control. Less than 10 minutes later, the heavy front door of the mansion burst open. Marcus stumbled into the grand foyer. He looked like a wounded and hunted animal. His tailored suit jacket was completely gone. His expensive silk tie had been ripped away. His crisp white shirt was soaked with nervous sweat and wrinkled beyond repair. He had not just been fired. He had been physically dragged out of his prestigious investment bank by armed corporate security guards in front of every single one of his wealthy colleagues. He was stripped of his keycards, his access codes, and his untouchable dignity. Valerie dropped her phone and rushed toward him, holding up the foreclosure binder. "Marcus, what is happening?" she shrieked. "Men in suits just handed me this notice. They said we have 48 hours to leave. Tell me this is a joke. Tell me you can fix this right now." Marcus did not even look at her. He shoved past my mother with a violent thrust of his shoulder, nearly knocking her to the marble floor. "Shut up, Valerie," he roared. His voice was raw and ragged. "Just shut your mouth. I have lost everything. The bank is seizing my portfolio. They are auditing my entire career. I am completely ruined." Before Valerie could recover from the physical shove, the front door burst open again. Julian charged into the foyer. The fake tech genius looked absolutely unhinged. There was fine glass dust covering his expensive cashmere sweater from where he had smashed his office furniture. His face was bright red and his eyes were wild with pure cornered panic. "You incompetent fool!" Julian screamed, lunging directly at Marcus. "You promised me the money was secure. You told me the 50 million was guaranteed. You just destroyed my company. My investors pulled out. The feds are looking into my offshore accounts. You ruined my entire life." Marcus spun around and grabbed Julian by the collar of his expensive sweater. The polished investment banker and the arrogant tech founder clashed violently in the center of the foyer. "You ruined my life, you parasitic fraud," Marcus bellowed, spitting the words directly into Julian's face. "Your company was a complete scam. You used stolen code. You lied to me about the collateral. You made me bypass security protocols for a fake project. I am facing federal prison because of your lies." They were two desperate con artists, realizing simultaneously that they had completely conned each other. They shoved and grappled, throwing wild and pathetic punches. The brotherhood they had loudly celebrated with expensive champagne just yesterday had instantly evaporated into pure, venomous hatred. Chloe stood at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at the physical brawl. She was not crying because her husband was facing criminal charges. She was not crying because her family was being violently evicted. She was crying because she did not get her new car. She gripped the mahogany banister and let out a shrill, deafening scream. "Stop it!" Chloe shrieked, stomping her foot like a spoiled toddler. "Marcus, you promised me a cherry-red convertible today. You humiliated me at the dealership. You are a broke, pathetic loser. And Julian, you promised we were flying to Monaco on a private jet. You are nothing but a fake. You are both useless. I cannot live in a house with no money." The golden child was finally showing her true colors. She only loved the providers when the providers had cash to burn. The exact second the money stopped flowing, her loyalty vanished entirely. She turned her vicious entitlement against the very men she had flaunted just hours before. Valerie was hyperventilating. She grabbed her chest, struggling to breathe as the reality of her poverty crashed down on her. She tried to assert control over the absolute chaos. "Stop fighting," she gasped. "Nia hung up on me. The useless girl refused to send her savings. We have nothing left. We have to work together." Her plea was entirely ignored. The perfect family completely fractured, tearing into each other like starving wolves locked in a cage. Marcus screamed at Chloe, calling her a lazy gold digger who contributed nothing to society. Julian screamed at Valerie, calling her a desperate old hag who worshipped fake money. Chloe screamed at everyone, threatening to divorce Julian immediately and find a man who could actually afford her lifestyle. Accusations flew through the air like poisoned darts. They dug up old resentments. They exposed each other's deepest insecurities. They violently shredded the fake upper-class facade they had spent years meticulously building. I sat in the quiet and absolute solitude of my impenetrable glass tower. The contrast was breathtaking. My environment was perfectly still, perfectly clean, and perfectly secure. Their environment was a chaotic, loud, and dirty war zone of their own making. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to throw a single punch. I simply removed the money, and their entire reality collapsed into savage, primitive violence. They were destroying each other far more effectively than I ever could. I took a slow sip of my black coffee and watched the monitors. The financial siege was working flawlessly. Now it was time to drop the final devastating hammer. The 48-hour eviction notice was ticking down to its final agonizing seconds. But Marcus and his parasitic circus had one last desperate play to make. The annual Atlanta Winter Gala was the absolute pinnacle of high society networking. It was a massive masquerade of wealth held in the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive downtown hotel. The entire event was supposedly dedicated to raising money for a children's charity, but everyone in that room knew the absolute truth. It was a ruthless financial hunting ground. It was a place where the rich came to display their dominance and the desperate came to beg for scraps. Marcus and Julian walked into the glittering ballroom sweating profusely inside their tailored tuxedos. Their credit cards were completely frozen, their bank accounts were locked. They had barely managed to scrape together enough cash from Chloe's forgotten emergency fund just to pay the exorbitant valet parking fee. But they had to be there. This gala was their absolute last chance to find a lifeline. Marcus was hunting for a private bridge loan from one of his former elite clients to stop the foreclosure. Julian was frantically searching for a gullible angel investor to resurrect his completely dead software startup. They were two drowning men trying to sell water to the ocean. The ballroom was decorated like a pristine winter wonderland. Massive ice sculptures shaped like swans slowly melted under the hot television lights. Waiters in crisp white gloves circulated through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and glasses of vintage champagne. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of expensive designer perfume and the foul stench of absolute hypocrisy. The people in this room smiled brightly at each other while secretly plotting hostile corporate takeovers. They kissed each other's cheeks while whispering vicious rumors behind their backs. This was the exact toxic ecosystem my family worshipped. They valued this shallow, glittering illusion more than they ever valued me. Marcus grabbed a glass of champagne and drained it in a single terrified gulp. His hands were shaking. The rumors of his catastrophic firing had already started to bleed through the tight-knit Atlanta financial community. He approached a group of wealthy real estate developers, forcing a wide, fake smile onto his face. He tried to project the image of a powerful managing director offering them a rare ground floor opportunity to invest in a revolutionary tech unicorn. He pitched Julian's company with desperate manic energy. He used every single buzzword he could remember. The developers simply stared at him with cold, calculating eyes. They swirled their expensive whiskey and exchanged knowing glances. One of them, an older billionaire who had done business with Vanguard Holdings, casually checked his diamond watch. He looked Marcus up and down with profound disgust. "I heard your bank escorted you out of the building with armed guards yesterday," Marcus the billionaire said loudly, causing several nearby guests to turn and stare. "I also heard that tech startup you are pushing just lost every single cent of its venture capital funding. You smell like a massive liability, Marcus. Do not ever approach my table again." Marcus physically recoiled as if he had been slapped across the face. His face burned with a deep and humiliating crimson flush. He backed away from the wealthy developers, retreating into the shadows near the extravagant dessert buffet. His chest heaved with absolute panic. The elite society he had dedicated his entire life to serving was now actively chewing him up and spitting him out. Across the ballroom, Julian was faring even worse. Without the backing of Marcus's bank and the false legitimacy of a $50 million loan, Julian was instantly recognized as the pathetic fraud he truly was. He tried to corner a group of young tech investors aggressively pitching his stolen source code. But the investors had all received the highly redacted forensic bulletin my team had anonymously leaked. They knew his code was stolen. They knew his offshore accounts were currently under federal investigation. They literally laughed directly in his face. They mocked his cheap cashmere sweater and told him to go back to whatever basement he crawled out of. Julian stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom, his fragile white male ego completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. While the men were actively drowning in professional humiliation, Valerie and Chloe were desperately trying to maintain their fake upper-class dignity. They stood near the grand staircase, desperately trying to blend in with the old money matriarchs of Atlanta. Chloe wore a sequined designer gown she had purchased weeks ago. Valerie wore a heavy diamond necklace she had forced Marcus to buy for her last Christmas. They smiled brightly and nodded eagerly, trying to force their way into conversations about private jets and summer homes in the Hamptons. But the other women in the room could smell their desperation. The elite socialites knew that true wealth never had to try so hard. Valerie attempted to boast about Marcus's powerful banking position, completely unaware that the news of his firing had already circulated the room. She loudly bragged about Julian's massive tech empire, claiming her daughter was married to the next great billionaire. The other women simply exchanged pitying smiles and politely excused themselves, leaving Valerie and Chloe standing completely alone next to a melting ice sculpture. Chloe's fake smile finally cracked. She grabbed a waiter by the arm and took 2 full glasses of champagne, downing them both in rapid succession. She turned to Valerie with panic in her eyes. "Mom, everyone is ignoring us!" Chloe hissed, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "The mayor's wife just looked right through me." The governor's daughter actually rolled her eyes when I mentioned Julian's company. "What is happening? Why are they treating us like garbage?" Valerie gripped Chloe's arm tightly, her perfectly manicured nails digging painfully into her daughter's skin. "Keep your voice down," Valerie commanded, a frantic edge bleeding into her tone. "Smile, Chloe. You have to keep smiling. If we look weak, they will eat us alive. We just need Marcus to secure one single investor tonight. Just one. If he fails, the sheriffs are coming to drag us out of the mansion tomorrow morning. Do not let them see you sweat." The perfect family finally huddled together in a dark corner near the kitchen doors. They looked like terrified refugees wearing expensive costumes. The shiny veneer of their high society lives had been completely stripped away, leaving nothing but raw and desperate terror. Marcus glared at Julian with pure hatred. Julian refused to make eye contact, staring blankly at the marble floor. Chloe glared at Marcus, blaming him for failing to provide her the royal lifestyle she demanded. Valerie glared at everyone, desperately trying to hold the crumbling pieces of her fake empire together through sheer force of will. They were standing in a room surrounded by hundreds of millions of dollars, but they had absolutely nothing. They were completely bankrupt in every single sense of the word. They had no money. They had no respect. They had no loyalty. They had traded their humanity for a fleeting taste of this glamorous and ruthless world, and now that very world was actively rejecting them. They were suffocating under the weight of their own massive lies. I knew exactly how desperate they were. I knew exactly how broken they felt. My security team had relayed their every humiliating rejection directly to my secure earpiece. The stage was perfectly set. The audience of billionaires and power brokers was completely primed. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom was thick with anticipation. The orchestral music swelled as the event organizers prepared to announce the major benefactors of the evening. Marcus and his parasitic family stood trembling in the shadows, praying for a miracle that would never arrive. They thought they had hit rock bottom. They thought the humiliation could not possibly get any worse. They had absolutely no idea that the real main event was just about to begin. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the crystal podium positioned at the very front of the grand ballroom. He tapped the microphone gently. The sharp sound cut cleanly through the low hum of desperate networking. He announced that the entire evening was made possible by a singular platinum benefactor. He did not say a name. He simply gestured toward the massive gilded double doors at the top of the sweeping marble staircase. The orchestral music immediately shifted from a soft background waltz to a powerful and commanding crescendo. Every single head in the ballroom turned simultaneously. The heavy gold-plated doors swung open with a smooth and dramatic sweep. I stepped out of the shadows and directly into the blinding spotlight. The entire hall fell completely and utterly silent. The clinking of expensive crystal glasses stopped instantly. The hushed whispers of corporate gossip died in the throats of the elite. The only sound left in the massive space was the sharp and deliberate click of my designer heels stepping onto the polished marble landing. I was no longer the invisible wife who scrubbed floors and faded into the background of a suburban mansion. I was a vision of absolute and uncompromising power. I wore a custom-designed evening gown crafted from heavy liquid silk in the deepest shade of midnight blue. The dress was an architectural masterpiece. It featured sharp, structured shoulders that projected pure dominance and a plunging neckline that demanded absolute confidence. The fabric flowed around my body like dark water reflecting the brilliant light of the chandeliers with every calculated step I took. But the dress was merely the canvas for the true display of my colossal wealth. I wore a matching set of internally flawless diamonds. The necklace rested heavily against my collarbone, featuring a massive sapphire pendant surrounded by dozens of blindingly brilliant cut stones. The matching chandelier earrings framed my face with cold, sparkling light. The entire jewelry set was worth a staggering $12 million. It was not rented. It was not borrowed. It was pulled directly from the private secure vault of Vanguard Holdings. I wore the gross domestic product of a small island nation around my neck, and I carried it with the effortless grace of a born queen. The ultra-wealthy socialites and ruthless billionaires of Atlanta simply stared in profound shock. They did not recognize me. How could they? Marcus had purposely kept me hidden away for 5 years, treating me like a shameful secret while he paraded his stolen wealth around the city. To the powerful people in this room, I was a complete mystery. I was a stunning, fiercely powerful woman, radiating the kind of intense gravitational pull that only true, unlimited money can buy. As I slowly descended the sweeping marble staircase, the crowd instinctively parted. They moved out of my way, like the sea dividing for a conquering monarch. The mayor of the city actually bowed his head slightly as I passed. A prominent federal judge offered a respectful nod. They did not know my name yet, but they instantly recognized my absolute authority. I walked through the center of the ballroom looking neither left nor right. I did not smile. I did not seek their approval. I forced them to seek mine. In the dark and pathetic corner near the swinging kitchen doors, my biological family and my treacherous husband were completely frozen. Marcus held a completely empty champagne flute in his trembling hand. Chloe had her mouth hanging wide open in a deeply unattractive display of pure shock. Valerie grabbed the edge of a high-top cocktail table so hard her knuckles turned completely white. Julian simply stared, his bloodshot eyes bulging out of his pale face. They watched me glide across the ballroom floor. Their brains violently rejected the information their eyes were feeding them. This could not possibly be Nia. This could not be the plain sister, the boring wife, the domestic servant they had gleefully discarded into a freezing storm just 48 hours ago. That woman was supposed to be shivering in a homeless shelter. That woman was supposed to be begging for scraps on the street. The woman commanding the respect of the entire Atlanta elite looked like a goddess of vengeance, but the facial features were undeniable. It was me. Marcus dropped his empty crystal glass. It shattered against the polished marble floor, but the sound was completely swallowed by the heavy silence of the room. I watched his mind frantically trying to construct a logical explanation for this impossible reality. I could see the exact moment his massive, arrogant ego manufactured a desperate and pathetic delusion to protect itself from completely shattering. He turned to Julian and whispered something frantic. Marcus convinced himself that I had not achieved this power on my own. His deeply ingrained misogyny and towering narcissism simply would not allow him to believe that the wife he deemed useless was actually a billionaire. He immediately assumed I was a high-priced escort. He convinced himself that I had somehow managed to attach myself to an incredibly wealthy tycoon. Valerie latched onto this toxic delusion instantly. She whispered furiously to Chloe, claiming that I must have found a desperate old sugar daddy to fund this lavish makeover. They nodded at each other, actively agreeing with this twisted fantasy. They rationalized that I was just wearing a rented dress and wearing borrowed diamonds to spite them. They believed I was just a cheap plus one riding on the coattails of a hidden male benefactor. They desperately needed to believe I was still inferior. They needed to believe I was still a parasite because that was the only way they could process their own catastrophic failures. They thought I had come to the gala solely to make Marcus jealous. They genuinely believed my entire spectacular transformation was just a pathetic cry for his attention. It was a staggering display of pure, unfiltered delusion. They were literally standing in the ashes of their own ruined lives, and they still thought the entire universe revolved around their petty desires. I knew exactly what they were thinking. I could read the pathetic, comforting lies written all over their terrified faces. I allowed them to hold on to that fragile delusion for a few more minutes because it would make the final execution so much more devastating. I did not walk toward their dark and miserable corner. Queens do not chase peasants. Queens wait on their thrones and force the peasants to crawl to them. I stopped in the exact center of the grand ballroom directly beneath the largest and brightest crystal chandelier. My private security detail flanked me instantly. 4 massive men in tailored black suits formed a protective perimeter, keeping the desperate social climbers at a comfortable distance. The master of ceremonies rushed over to me, sweating profusely and fawning with sickening subservience. He offered me a silver tray with a single glass of vintage champagne. I took the glass without looking at him. I turned my body very slowly and finally locked my gaze directly onto the dark corner where Marcus and my family were hiding. I stared right into my husband's panicked eyes. I stared right into my mother's terrified soul. I raised my crystal glass exactly 1 inch. It was the exact same mocking gesture Valerie had given me through the rain-streaked window of the mansion. The color completely drained from my mother's face. Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly against his tight collar. The temporary delusion that I was just a wealthy man's arm candy began to rapidly dissolve under the sheer weight of my crushing stare. No sugar daddy was stepping forward to claim me. No hidden billionaire was standing by my side holding my hand. I stood entirely alone, completely independent, and absolutely terrifying. I was the center of gravity in a room filled with the most powerful people in the state, and I was looking at my family like they were nothing more than insects waiting to be crushed. The trap was fully sprung. The audience of billionaires and power brokers was completely captivated by my presence. The desperate fools in the corner were completely out of time, completely out of money, and completely out of options. They could not hide in the shadows any longer. The magnetic pull of my authority was dragging them out into the light. They had no choice but to approach the throne and face the very woman they had tried to destroy. Marcus broke away from the pathetic huddle in the dark corner. He could not stand the public defiance for a single second longer. His bruised and fragile ego demanded immediate action. He marched across the polished marble floor of the grand ballroom. He was sweating profusely inside his tailored tuxedo. His face was a chaotic and desperate mixture of blind rage and absolute terror. He genuinely thought he still controlled me. He thought he could simply walk up to the woman he had discarded and forcefully drag her back into a state of quiet submission. He stomped toward the center of the room, completely ignoring the silent and judgmental stares of the billionaires and power brokers surrounding us. "Nia, what the hell do you think you are doing here?" he hissed. He kept his voice low, but the aggressive venom in his tone was unmistakable. He reached out his right hand, his fingers curling like tight talons. He aimed directly for my wrist. He intended to grab me physically and drag me out the side doors like a disobedient child. He wanted to pull me into the service alleyway and hide his burning shame in the dark. He wanted to violently reassert his dominance and silence the woman who was currently commanding the entire room. He never even made contact. Before his sweating fingers could brush the delicate silk of my gown, 2 members of my private security detail moved with terrifying and absolute speed. They were giant walls of solid, disciplined muscle encased in bespoke black suits. One guard grabbed Marcus by his extended wrist, applying immediate and bone-crushing pressure. The other guard stepped directly between us, shoving Marcus violently backward. The force of the defensive shove lifted Marcus entirely off his feet. He stumbled wildly backward, his expensive leather shoes sliding uncontrollably on the polished marble. He crashed hard onto the floor, landing directly at my feet in a pathetic heap of wrinkled fabric and shattered pride. The entire grand ballroom gasped in absolute unison. The mayor stopped mid-sentence. The elite billionaires lowered their crystal glasses. The silence in the room became absolute and suffocating. The wealthy crowd watched with wide eyes as the former titan of investment banking was physically tossed to the ground like a common trespasser. Valerie and Chloe watched from the shadows, clutching each other in pure horror as their primary provider was publicly humiliated. Julian, seeing Marcus humiliated on the floor, realized their last shred of credibility was rapidly evaporating. He stepped forward, trying desperately to salvage the unsalvageable situation. He tried to project his fake Silicon Valley charm to the watching crowd. He plastered a sickeningly confident smile onto his pale face and addressed the surrounding billionaires instead of me. "Let us all just calm down," Julian announced, his voice carrying a manufactured and arrogant warmth. "This is just a simple family misunderstanding. My sister-in-law here is just overwhelmed by the glamour of the evening. We are actually here celebrating my new tech startup, a $50 million venture that is poised to disrupt the entire global financial sector. I am the founder and visionary CEO." He actually thought he could spin this absolute disaster into a networking opportunity. He thought he could use my dramatic and commanding presence to attract the attention of the investors who had rejected him earlier. I looked at Julian. I let a cold, razor-sharp smile stretch slowly across my face. I did not lower my voice. I did not need to shout. I spoke with the calm, absolute certainty of a woman holding the power of life and death over their futures. I wanted every powerful person in that massive ballroom to hear the absolute and devastating truth. "You are not a founder, Julian," I said. My voice echoed through the room with crystal-clear acoustics slicing through his pathetic lies like a surgical scalpel. "You are an absolute thief." Julian's fake smile faltered, but he tried to maintain his arrogant posture. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. "Your entire software startup is a complete and utter fraud," I announced to the silent room. "You stole the proprietary source code from a defunct European database. You did not write a single line of viable code in your entire life. You paid a cheap freelance developer $2,000 to build a fake user interface so you could trick gullible investors into wiring you millions of dollars. You then established illegal shell companies in the Cayman Islands designed specifically to funnel that stolen money out of the country in a massive hit-and-run wire fraud operation." Julian's face completely drained of color. The investors standing nearby began to whisper frantically among themselves, physically stepping away from him as if he carried a deadly disease. "That is a complete lie," Julian stammered. Sweat poured down his forehead, ruining his carefully styled hair. "You have absolutely no proof of any of that. You are just a crazy and bitter woman." "I have the raw server logs," I replied. My diamond necklace caught the blinding light of the chandelier as I delivered the fatal blow. "I have the offshore account routing numbers. I have the exact digital timestamps of your illegal data transfers. And as of 3 hours ago, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has the complete forensic dossier sitting directly on their desks. You are not going to disrupt the financial sector, Julian. You are going to a federal penitentiary." Julian crumbled. His knees buckled slightly, and he let out a pathetic, whimpering sound. The tech genius facade dissolved instantly, leaving behind nothing but a terrified con artist facing decades behind bars. He looked back at Chloe, but she just stared at him with absolute disgust, realizing her ticket to endless luxury was actually a fast track to federal prison. I turned my absolute authority away from Julian and looked down at Marcus. Marcus was desperately scrambling to his feet. His tailored tuxedo was covered in dust from the marble floor. He tried to speak, He tried to issue another arrogant command, but I cut him off instantly. I delivered a verbal execution so precise and so devastating that it would permanently end his existence in the financial world. "And you, Marcus," I announced, projecting my voice to the elite crowd. "You are no longer a managing director. You are a massive financial liability who was escorted out of your own bank by armed guards yesterday afternoon." I looked directly at the mayor and the elite billionaires who had rejected Marcus earlier in the evening. Marcus Vance is drowning in toxic high-interest debt. He remortgaged his house 3 times just to maintain his fake wealthy lifestyle. He bypassed severe corporate compliance protocols to fraudulently approve Julian's fake $50 million loan. He illegally attached his own personal portfolio as the primary guarantor for a massive wire fraud scheme. The collective gasp from the elite crowd was deafening. In the ruthless world of high finance, bad debt, and deliberate corporate fraud were the ultimate unforgivable sins. The billionaires who had previously tolerated Marcus now looked at him with absolute disgust and pure revulsion. Marcus was instantly and permanently blacklisted from every single financial institution in the country right in front of my eyes. His professional reputation was entirely incinerated. He was exposed as a reckless fool who had gambled his entire career on a pathetic scam. Marcus stared at me. His mouth hung wide open. The blood completely left his face, making his skin look like gray ash. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. He looked at the flawless $12 million diamonds resting heavily against my collarbone. He looked at the highly trained corporate security detail protecting me with lethal efficiency. He looked at the precise, terrifyingly accurate financial data I had just unleashed upon him and Julian in front of the most powerful people in the state. The pathetic and comforting delusion that I was just a rented +1 belonging to a rich man completely shattered in his mind. No sugar daddy would ever have access to those highly classified internal banking records. No random tycoon would know the exact routing numbers of Julian's offshore accounts. No simple escort could command a private security team to physically throw a managing director to the floor with such absolute legal impunity. The terrifying and earth-shattering realization finally dawned on him. His eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror. His hands began to shake violently at his sides. He looked at my cold posture and my unyielding gaze. He began to vaguely realize the colossal and unstoppable force standing right in front of him. The invisible empire that had crushed his bank accounts, foreclosed his mansion, and evaporated Julian's funding was not a faceless, aggressive corporation. It was his wife. The quiet woman he had violently thrown into the freezing rain was the exact person holding the executioner's blade. He was staring directly at the architect of his total destruction, and he was entirely powerless to stop it. The harsh and unforgiving morning light offered absolutely zero comfort to the 4 broken people huddled inside the freezing foyer of the foreclosed mansion. They had not slept a single second. They had spent the entire night pacing the cold marble floors, trapped in a suffocating nightmare of their own making. At exactly 6 in the morning, the heavy brass knocker sounded again. It was not a process server this time. It was a high-level corporate courier dressed in tactical black. He handed Marcus a thick, sealed envelope stamped with the terrifying crimson crest of Vanguard Holdings. It was a mandatory and immediate summons. The document explicitly stated that Marcus, Julian, Chloe, and Valerie were required to appear at the Vanguard Executive Tower by 9 in the morning for a final asset resolution hearing. The document carried a lethal warning. Failure to appear would result in the immediate dispatch of federal marshals to execute outstanding arrest warrants for corporate wire fraud and illegal financial manipulation. They did not speak a single word to each other as they traveled to the financial district. Marcus could not even order a luxury rideshare because all of his accounts were completely dead. They were forced to ride the public transit train sitting on hard plastic seats surrounded by everyday morning commuters. Marcus stared blankly at the floor of the train car holding the Vanguard summons in his trembling hands. His mind was completely fractured. The devastating events of the gala played on a continuous agonizing loop behind his bloodshot eyes. He knew Nia was the architect of his public execution. He knew she possessed a terrifying and overwhelming power, but his shattered ego desperately tried to rationalize the nightmare. He convinced himself that Nia had simply manipulated the notoriously ruthless chairperson of Vanguard Holdings. He believed she had fed the chairman the financial data to execute this revenge. He still could not fathom that the quiet woman he had discarded was the actual supreme ruler of the entire empire. He was terrified of Nia, but he was absolutely paralyzed with dread at the prospect of facing the phantom chairperson who wielded the legal power to send them all to a federal penitentiary. The Vanguard Holdings Tower loomed over them like a massive black tombstone. Standing at the base of the colossal glass and steel skyscraper, the four of them looked exactly like what they were. They were tiny, insignificant insects preparing to be crushed under the boot of a relentless corporate machine. They walked through the towering, revolving doors and stepped into the cavernous main lobby. The temperature inside was freezing. The walls were clad in seamless black marble that absorbed all the light. A team of elite armed security guards approached them immediately. There was no polite greeting. There was only cold, mechanical efficiency. The guards forced them to surrender their cell phones, their keys, and any metallic objects. They were stripped of their last remaining connections to the outside world. They were completely isolated and entirely at the mercy of the corporation they had tried to defraud. An armed guard escorted them to a private express elevator hidden behind a polished steel wall. The doors closed silently, entombing them in a claustrophobic metal box. The elevator shot upward with terrifying speed. The sudden change in cabin pressure made their ears pop painfully. Chloe gripped the handrail, her knuckles turning completely white. She was breathing in short, shallow gasps. Julian stood in the corner of the elevator, shivering violently. His expensive cashmere sweater was stained with sour, nervous sweat. He looked like a man walking directly toward the electric chair. Valerie clutched her designer handbag against her chest, closing her eyes and muttering desperate, silent prayers. Marcus simply stared at the digital floor indicator, watching the red numbers climb higher and higher. Floor 50, floor 60, floor 70. Every passing number felt like a heavy hammer striking directly against his sternum. His heart hammered so fiercely against his ribcage, he thought his chest might actually split open. The elevator chimed a sharp and chilling note as it arrived at the absolute top floor. The steel doors parted, revealing a vast and sterile executive waiting area. The guard directed them down a long, silent corridor and pushed open the heavy glass door of the primary boardroom. It was a massive psychological torture chamber designed specifically to intimidate. The room was suspended hundreds of feet in the air, surrounded entirely by floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a dizzying and terrifying view of the city dropping away below. The center of the room was dominated by a colossal table forged from a single piece of dark steel. The chairs were stiff, uncomfortable black leather. The air conditioning hummed with a low, aggressive frequency that chilled the sweat on their skin. "Sit," the armed guard commanded, pointing to 4 chairs grouped tightly together on one side of the massive steel table. The guard stepped backward out of the room, and the heavy glass door clicked shut, sealing them inside the transparent box. The psychological anxiety in the room was thick enough to choke on. There was a large analog clock mounted on the far wall. The second hand ticked with a loud rhythmic snap that echoed off the cold glass. Tick, tick, tick. Every single second amplified their absolute terror. Julian collapsed into his chair and buried his face in his trembling hands. He began to weep openly. The arrogant white tech bro was completely gone, reduced to a sobbing and pathetic mess. He muttered frantically about federal prison, about how he was not built for confinement, about how his entire life was ruined. He rocked back and forth in the leather chair, completely consumed by raw, unadulterated panic. "Shut up!" Julian Marcus hissed, his voice shaking with suppressed rage and profound fear. "Just shut your mouth. We have to figure out what we are going to say to the chairman. We have to negotiate a surrender. Negotiate, Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. She slammed her hands onto the cold steel table. There is no negotiation, Marcus. They took the house, they took the cars, they took the money. What do we possibly have left to offer a billionaire chairman? We have absolutely nothing. You promised me a life of unlimited luxury, and you dragged me into a federal fraud investigation. I am going to jail because of your massive incompetence. Valerie reached out and grabbed Chloe's wrist, desperately trying to hush her favorite daughter. Do not yell, Chloe. Valerie whispered frantically, casting terrified glances at the glass walls. They are watching us. The chairman is definitely watching us right now. We have to look composed. We have to look like we deserve mercy. We are a family of high standing and we must maintain our dignity. Mercy. Marcus let out a harsh and broken laugh. The sound scraped painfully against his dry throat. Vanguard Holdings does not show mercy, Valerie. They are legendary for destroying companies and liquidating assets with absolute zero hesitation. And now we are sitting in their primary execution chamber. Marcus dragged his sweating palms across his face, wiping away the cold moisture. His breathing was dangerously shallow and rapid. His tailored tuxedo from the gala was wrinkled and covered in dust, but it felt like a straitjacket constricting his movements. His mind raced at a frantic pace, trying to formulate a legal defense that simply did not exist. He planned to blame the entire fraudulent loan scheme squarely on Julian. He planned to beg the chairperson for a payment plan stretching across the next 50 years. He was fully prepared to drop to his knees and sacrifice every single shred of his remaining dignity just to avoid a federal indictment. He stared intensely at the empty, imposing chair positioned at the head of the massive steel table. He visualized a ruthless old corporate titan walking through the door, ready to sign their absolute death warrants. The tension in the glass boardroom reached an excruciating and unbearable peak. The air was completely suffocated by the foul smell of their collective fear. Julian's pathetic sobbing, Chloe's rapid hyperventilation, Valerie's desperate delusional whispering, and Marcus's silent internal screaming created a symphony of absolute despair. They were entirely trapped in a transparent cage hovering over the city they once thought they ruled. They watched the heavy glass door waiting for their executioner to arrive. Their hearts pounded in a violent, synchronized rhythm of pure dread. They had absolutely no idea that the monster they were waiting to beg for their miserable lives was the very same woman they had starved, mocked, and thrown out into the freezing rain. The heavy glass door of the primary boardroom unsealed with a sharp mechanical hiss. The four of them jumped violently in their leather chairs. The loud rhythmic ticking of the wall clock seemed to instantly stop. The executioner had finally arrived. Footsteps echoed in the silent corridor. They were sharp, deliberate clicks of expensive heels striking against the polished marble floor. Every single breath in the glass room was completely held. The armed guard stepped aside and pulled the door wide open. I walked into the execution chamber. I wore a pristine white tailored suit that radiated absolute and uncompromising authority. 4 elite corporate attorneys flanked me, carrying the thick black binders containing the instruments of their total destruction. I did not look at my family immediately. I walked with slow, measured precision directly toward the head of the massive steel table. I stood behind the imposing black leather chair. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a solid brass nameplate. I set it down on the cold steel table with a heavy resonant thud. The engraved black letters faced them directly, catching the harsh fluorescent light of the boardroom. Chairperson of the board, Nia Vanguard. I sat down slowly in my throne. I crossed my legs and finally leveled my gaze at the pathetic, trembling creatures sitting across from me. Marcus stared at the brass plate. He stared at my face. He stared at the pristine white suit. The cognitive dissonance was so violently severe that his brain practically snapped in half. The quiet, submissive woman he had violently thrown into the freezing rain was the supreme ruler of his entire financial universe. The realization hit him with the catastrophic force of a speeding freight train. His breathing completely stopped. The blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. His legs simply stopped functioning. He slid helplessly out of his black leather chair. He collapsed onto the floor. His knees hit the hard ground with a dull, sickening thud. The arrogant managing director, the titan of industry, the man who bragged about his massive wealth, was kneeling directly before the wife he had brutally discarded. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He tried to form words, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed by pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at the legal binders stacked in front of my attorneys. He looked at the armed guards standing at the door. He finally understood that he had not just made a terrible mistake. He had committed absolute financial suicide. Julian read the nameplate and let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. The fraudulent white tech bro instantly recognized that the woman he had mocked in her own home was the exact person holding his entire life and his physical freedom in her hands. He scrambled out of his seat. He threw his body onto the floor right next to Marcus. He clasped his sweating hands together in a desperate, frantic prayer. "Please, Nia," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, terrified squeal. "Please do not hand the server logs over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I will do anything you want. I will give you everything back. I will sign a full confession. Please do not send me to federal prison. I am not built for a cage." "You know I am not built for a cage." He openly wept. Thick tears streamed down his flushed face and dripped onto the expensive carpet. He babbled uncontrollably about his offshore accounts and his stolen code, openly admitting to every single federal crime in a room filled with corporate lawyers. His arrogance had completely evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic coward begging for his life. Chloe was completely paralyzed. Her jaw hung open. Her eyes darted wildly between me and the gleaming brass nameplate. The golden child finally understood that her entire lavish existence was a temporary illusion, completely funded by the sister she had relentlessly abused. She had no sports car. She had no mansion. She had a husband weeping on the floor, begging to avoid a federal indictment. She was absolutely nothing. She gripped the edge of the steel table, her mind completely broken by the colossal shift in power. Valerie reacted with pure primitive survival instinct. The woman who had proudly toasted to my exile immediately threw away her fake high society pride. She dropped to her knees beside Marcus and Julian. She crawled slightly forward on the floor. Her designer dress dragged across the ground. She reached out her hand as if trying to touch the hem of my suit. "Nia, my sweet girl," Valerie cried, forcing massive fake tears to well up in her eyes. "My beloved biological daughter. I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness. I always knew you were the strongest one in the family. We are family, Nia. Blood is thicker than water. You must forgive us. We made a terrible mistake, but we are your flesh and blood. Please have mercy on your own mother. Mercy." My private security detail immediately stepped forward, but I raised a single finger, halting them in their tracks. I wanted Valerie to stay exactly where she was. I wanted her to feel the cold, hard floor beneath her knees. I looked down at the three of them kneeling before me. I looked at Chloe, paralyzed in her chair. The power dynamic in the room was absolute and completely irreversible. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cold steel table. The air in the room grew completely stagnant. "You ask for mercy," I said. My voice echoed with a terrifying stillness that froze the blood in their veins. "You invoke the name of family as if that word grants you a shield from the consequences of your own boundless greed." I looked directly into Marcus's terrified eyes. "I cooked," I said, my voice striking like a hammer. "I washed your clothes. I was trampled upon." I shifted my gaze to Valerie's desperate, weeping face. "I endured your daily insults. I cooked. I supported you when you had absolutely nothing. I was trampled upon." I looked at Chloe and Julian, the parasites who had tried to steal my home. "I was thrown out into a violent, freezing storm while you drank my champagne. I cooked. I was trampled upon." I stood up slowly, towering over them. I let the full weight of my presence crush the remaining oxygen out of the room. The rhythm of my words was a relentless drumbeat of their destruction. You demanded my submission. You demanded my silence. You demanded my home and my dignity. You thought you could strip me bare and leave me to freeze because you firmly believed I had no power to strike back. I stepped out from behind the massive steel table. I looked down at the weeping, begging figures huddled on the floor. I do not forgive, I stated the words ringing with absolute finality. I show no mercy. Marcus let out a broken, sobbing gasp. He finally found his voice. Nia, please. He choked out, his chest heaving. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I will sign the divorce papers. I will give you whatever you want. Just please do not let them take my banking license. Do not let them take my freedom. You have nothing left to give me, Marcus, I replied coldly. I already took the mansion. I already took your bank accounts. Your banking license was permanently revoked the exact second my legal team submitted the evidence of your corporate fraud to the Federal Regulatory Commission this morning. You are not a managing director. You are a highly toxic liability. Julian continued to wail, clutching at the carpet. Valerie pressed her forehead against the floor, sobbing loudly and praying for a miracle. There would be no miracles today. There would only be the harsh, brutal reality of complete and total financial annihilation. They had built their entire lives on a foundation of lies and cruelty, and I had just detonated the explosive charges that brought the entire structure crashing down on their heads. I raised my right hand and gave a sharp, single nod to the lead attorney standing beside me. He tapped a button on his smartwatch. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open immediately. 4 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers stepped into the room, followed closely by 2 uniformed Atlanta police officers. They moved with absolute tactical precision. Julian let out a terrified shriek and tried to crawl backward under the massive steel table, but the agents were entirely too fast. They grabbed him by the arms, hauling him forcefully to his feet. The cold steel handcuffs clicked sharply around his wrists, securing his hands behind his back. The lead agent recited the federal wire fraud and grand larceny charges with a booming voice that echoed off the glass walls. Julian sobbed uncontrollably, begging Chloe to call a lawyer, begging Marcus to save him. Chloe simply shrank back into her leather chair, pressing her hands over her ears. She watched the fake billionaire she had proudly flaunted being violently dragged out of the room like a common criminal. Her golden ticket was gone forever, leaving her completely exposed. I turned my attention back to Marcus. He was still kneeling on the floor, his eyes wide and vacant. My lead attorney stepped forward and dropped a thick stack of legal documents directly onto the carpet in front of him. Marcus stared blindly at the bold black text. It was his official termination letter from the investment bank, signed directly by the board of directors. It was accompanied by a multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit holding him personally liable for the fraudulent loan guarantee. The final document was the immediate eviction order for the Buckhead mansion. Marcus reached out with a trembling hand, but he could not even bring himself to touch the papers. He was entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his absolute ruin. "You have 0 assets, Marcus," I said, looking down at his broken form. "You have 0 leverage, and you have 0 future in this city. You are nothing but a convicted fraudster drowning in an ocean of toxic debt." I signaled to my private security team. The 2 massive guards who had protected me at the gala stepped forward. They grabbed Marcus by his shoulders and hauled him roughly to his feet. He did not fight them. He had absolutely no fight left in his hollow chest. "Throw him out!" I commanded, my voice echoing with icy finality. "Escort him to the ground floor and throw him out the front doors. Do not let him take a single piece of corporate property. Do not let him make a single phone call. Leave him exactly where he belongs." The guards dragged Marcus toward the boardroom doors. His expensive leather shoes dragged uselessly across the carpet. He looked back at me one last time, his eyes pleading for a fraction of the mercy he had completely denied me. I stared back at him with absolute nothingness. The doors closed, sealing his fate. Minutes later, my security feeds showed Marcus being physically shoved out the towering glass doors of the Vanguard building. He stumbled and fell hard onto the unforgiving concrete pavement of the downtown financial district. He had no suit jacket. He had no phone. He had absolutely no money. He was left completely empty-handed on the cold street, exactly like the rainy night he threw me out of my own home. The irony was absolute and perfect. I finally turned my gaze to Valerie and Chloe. My mother was still kneeling on the floor, shivering in her expensive designer dress. Chloe was hyperventilating, her makeup smeared completely across her face. "You have exactly 2 hours to return to the mansion and pack your personal belongings," I told them. "You are permitted to take one trash bag of clothing each. Any attempt to remove jewelry, art, or property belonging to the estate will result in immediate arrest for grand theft." Valerie began to weep loudly, reaching her hands up toward me in a final desperate plea. "Nia, please," she sobbed. "Where are we supposed to go? We have absolutely no money. We cannot survive on the streets." "You will survive exactly how you expected me to survive," I replied, my tone completely devoid of any sympathy. "I have graciously arranged a small studio apartment for you in the deepest part of the South Side slums. The first month's rent is paid. After that, you are entirely on your own. I highly suggest you learn how to scrub floors and wash dishes, Valerie, because your days of drinking imported champagne are permanently over." My security guards escorted the weeping women out of the building. The Great Purge was finally complete. Within hours, the perfect fake family was entirely eradicated from high society. Valerie and Chloe were forced to drag cheap black garbage bags into a cramped, roach-infested apartment surrounded by peeling paint and broken windows. The golden child and the arrogant matriarch were reduced to absolute poverty, forced to face the harsh and brutal reality of the world without my hidden wealth to protect them. Marcus was wandering the streets of Atlanta, a broken and destitute man, facing a mountain of federal lawsuits that would keep him buried for the rest of his miserable life. Julian was sitting in a cold holding cell, awaiting a federal trial that would undoubtedly end in a massive prison sentence. The parasitic infection had been completely cured. The sun began to set over the sprawling city of Atlanta, casting long, dramatic shadows across the affluent neighborhoods. I walked into the grand foyer of the Buckhead mansion. The house was perfectly silent. The chaotic noise of my treacherous family was completely gone, wiped away like dust. The air was clean and still. I walked across the imported Italian marble floors, making my way into the expansive living room. The sheer silk curtains were drawn back, revealing the massive bay windows. I walked over to the expensive velvet sofa. It was the exact same spot where Valerie had sat with her crystal glass, smiling as she watched me freeze in the storm. I slowly sat down, sinking into the plush fabric. I wore a stunning crimson silk dress that contrasted sharply against the dark room. I reached out and picked up a heavy crystal glass filled with a rare and expensive vintage red wine. The house belonged to me. The empire belonged to me. The absolute power belonged entirely to me. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of the dark red wine. The flavor was rich and incredibly complex. I looked out the massive bay windows at the rolling front lawn and the long, winding concrete driveway. The sky outside was clear and calm, but the memory of that violent storm still echoed in the atmosphere. I rested the crystal glass on my knee. My breathing was perfectly steady. My heart beat with a slow and powerful rhythm. I looked at my own reflection in the darkening glass of the window. My gaze was completely serene. A slow, quiet smile stretched across my face, radiating absolute and undeniable dominance. The weak and invisible wife was gone forever. The one pushed out into the rain had become the one who creates the lightning.